The Turn of the Screw by Henry James.
The story had held us round the fire, sufficiently breathless, but except the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as on Christmas Eve in an old house a strange tale should essentially be, I remember no comment uttered, till somebody happened to say that it was the only case he had met in which such a visitation had fallen on a child. It was this observation that drew from Douglas, not immediately, but later in the evening, a reply that had the interesting consequence to which I call attention. I quite agree, in regard to Griffin's ghost, or whatever it was, that its appearing first to the little boy at so tender an age adds a particular touch, but it's not the first occurrence of its charming kind that I know to have involved a child. If the child gives the effect another turn of the screw, what do you say to two children? We say, of course, somebody exclaimed, that they give two turns, also that we want to hear about them. I can see Douglas there before the fire, to which he had got up to present his back, looking down at his interlocutor with his hands in his pockets. Nobody but me, till now, has ever heard. It's quite too horrible. It's beyond everything. Nothing at all that I know touches it. For sheer terror, I remember asking. For general uncanny ugliness and horror and pain. Well then, I said, just sit right down and begin. He turned round to the fire, gave a kick to a log, watched it an instant. Then, as he faced us again, I can't begin. I shall have to send to town. The story's written. It's in a locked drawer. It has not been out for years. It is an old, faded ink, and in the most beautiful hand. He hung fire again. A woman's. She has been dead these 20 years. She sent me the pages in question before she died. She was a most charming person, but she was 10 years older than I. She was my sister's governess, he quietly said. She was the most agreeable woman I've ever known in her position. She would have been worthy of any whatever. It was long ago, and this episode was long before. Oh, yes, don't grin. I liked her extremely, and am glad to this day to think she liked me, too. If she hadn't, she wouldn't have told me. She had never told anyone. It wasn't simply that she said so, but that I knew she hadn't. I was sure. I could see. You'll easily judge why when you hear. I fixed him. I see. She was in love. He laughed for the first time. You are acute. Yes, she was in love. Mrs. Griffin expressed the need for a little more light. Who was it she was in love with? The story will tell, I took upon myself to reply. Won't you tell, Douglas? Somebody else inquired. He sprang to his feet again. Yes, tomorrow. Now I must go to bed. Good night. And quickly, catching up a candlestick, he left us, slightly bewildered. I knew the next day that a letter containing the key had, by the first post, gone off to his London apartments, but in spite of, or perhaps just on account of, the eventual diffusion of this knowledge, we quite let him alone till after dinner. Then he became as communicative as we could desire, and indeed gave us his best reason for being so. It appeared that the narrative he had promised to read us really required for a proper intelligence a few words of prologue. The first of these conveyed that the written statement took up the tale at a point after it had, in a manner, begun. The fact to be in possession of was therefore that his old friend, the youngest of several daughters of a poor country parson, had, at the age of 20, on taking service for the first time in the schoolroom, come up to London, in trepidation, to answer in person an advertisement that had already placed her in brief correspondence with the advertiser. This person proved, on her presenting herself for judgment at a house in Harley Street that impressed her as vast and imposing, this prospective patron proved a gentleman, a bachelor in the prime of life, such a figure as had never risen, save in a dream or an old novel, before a fluttered, anxious girl out of a Hampshire vicarage. He had been left, by the death of their parents in India, guardian to a small nephew and a small niece, children of a younger, a military brother, whom he had lost 2 years before. He had sent them down to his other house in Essex, the proper place for them being, of course, the country, and kept them there from the first, with the best people he could find to look after them, parting even with his own servants to wait on them, and going down himself, whenever he might, to see how they were doing. He had put them in possession of Bly, which was healthy and secure, and had placed at the head of their little establishment, but below stairs only, an excellent woman, Mrs. Grose, whom he was sure his visitor would like, and who had formerly been maid to his mother. She was now housekeeper, and was also acting for the time as superintendent to the little girl, of whom, without children of her own, she was, by good luck, extremely fond. There were plenty of people to help, but of course the young lady who should go down as governess would be in supreme authority. She would also have, in holidays, to look after the small boy, who had been for a term at school, young as he was to be sent, but what else could be done, and who, as the holidays were about to begin, would be back from one day to the other. There had been for the 2 children at first a young lady whom they had had the misfortune to lose. She had done for them quite beautifully. She was a most respectable person, till her death, the great awkwardness of which had, precisely, left no alternative but the school for little Miles. In her successor's place, I suggested, I should have wished to learn if the office brought with it necessary danger to life. Douglas completed my thought. She did wish to learn, and she did learn. You shall hear tomorrow what she learnt. Meanwhile, of course, the prospect struck her as slightly grim, but the salary offered much exceeded her modest measure, and on a second interview she faced the music. She engaged. And Douglas, with this, made a pause that, for the benefit of the company, moved me to throw in, the moral of which was, of course, the seduction exercised by the splendid young man. She succumbed to it. A little to my surprise, on this, Douglas turned round to me. There were others, he went on, who hadn't succumbed. He told her frankly all his difficulty, that for several applicants the conditions had been prohibitive. They were, somehow, simply afraid. It sounded dull, it sounded strange, and all the more so because of his main condition, which was that she should never trouble him, but never, never. Neither appeal nor complain, nor write about anything. Only meet all questions herself, receive all moneys from his solicitor, take the whole thing over, and let him alone. She promised to do this, and she mentioned to me that when, for a moment, disburdened, delighted, he held her hand, thanking her for the sacrifice, she already felt rewarded. But was that all her reward? One of the ladies asked. She never saw him again. Oh, said the lady, which was the only other word of importance contributed to the subject, till the next night, by the corner of the hearth, in the best chair, he opened the faded red cover of a thin, old-fashioned, gilt-edged album. The whole thing took indeed more nights than one, but on the first occasion the same lady put another question. What is your title? I haven't one. Oh, I have, I said. But Douglas, without heeding me, had begun to read with a fine clearness that was like a rendering to the ear of the beauty of his author's hand. I remember the whole beginning as a succession of flights and drops, a little seesaw of the right throbs and the wrong.
After rising in time to meet his appeal, I had at all events a couple of very bad days, found myself doubtful again, felt indeed sure I had made a mistake. In this state of mind, I spent the long hours of bumping, swinging coach that carried me to the stopping place, at which I was to be met by a vehicle from the house. This conveyance, I was told, had been ordered, and I found, towards the close of the June afternoon, a commodious fly in waiting for me. I suppose I had expected, or had dreaded, something so melancholy that what greeted me was a good surprise. I remember as a most pleasant impression the broad, clear front, its open windows and fresh curtains, and the pair of maids looking out. And there immediately appeared at the door, with a little girl in her hand, a civil person who dropped me as decent a curtsy as if I'd been the mistress or a distinguished visitor. I had no drop again till the next day, for I was carried triumphantly through the following hours by my introduction to the younger of my pupils. The little girl who accompanied Mrs. Gross appeared to me on the spot a creature so charming as to make it a great fortune to have to do with her. She was the most beautiful child I had ever seen, and I afterwards wondered that my employer had not told me more of her. To watch, teach, form little Flora would too evidently be the making of a happy and useful life, and I felt quite sure she would presently like me. It was part of what I already liked Mrs. Gross herself for, the pleasure I could see her feel in my admiration and wonder as I sat at supper with 4 tall candles, and with my pupil in a high chair and a bib brightly facing me between them over bread and milk. There were naturally things that in Flora's presence could pass between us only as prodigious and gratified looks, obscure and roundabout allusions. And the little boy, does he look like her? Is he, too, so very remarkable? One wouldn't flatter a child. Oh, miss, most remarkable. If you think well of this one. And she stood there with a plate in her hand, beaming at our companion, who looked from one of us to the other with placid, heavenly eyes that contained nothing to check us. Yes, if I do. You will be carried away by the little gentleman. Well, that, I think, is what I came for, to be carried away. I'm afraid, however, I remember feeling the impulse to add, I'm rather easily carried away. I was carried away in London. I can still see Mrs. Gross's broad face as she took this in. In Harley Street? In Harley Street. Oh, well, miss, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. Oh, I've no pretension, I could laugh, to being the only one. My other pupil, at any rate, as I understand, comes back tomorrow. Not tomorrow, Friday, miss. He arrives as you did by the coach, under care of the guard, and is to be met by the same carriage. I forthwith expressed that the proper, as well as the pleasant and friendly thing, would be therefore that on the arrival of the public conveyance I should be in waiting for him with his little sister, an idea in which Mrs. Gross concurred so heartily that I somehow took her manner as a kind of comforting pledge, never falsified, thank heavens, that we should on every question be quite at one. Oh, she was glad I was there. What I felt the next day was, I suppose, nothing that could be fairly called a reaction from the cheer of my arrival. It was probably at the most only a slight oppression produced by a fuller measure of the scale as I walked round them, gazed up at them, took them in, of my new circumstances. They had, as it were, an extent and mass for which I had not been prepared, and in the presence of which I found myself freshly a little scared, as well as a little proud. Lessons in this agitation certainly suffered some delay. I reflected that my first duty was, by the gentlest arts I could contrive, to win the child into the sense of knowing me. I spent the day with her out of doors. I arranged with her, to her great satisfaction, that it should be she only, who might show me the place. She showed it, step by step, and room by room, and secret by secret, with droll, delightful, childish talk about it, and with the result, in half an hour, of our becoming immense friends. Young as she was, I was struck throughout our little tour with her confidence and courage, with the way, in empty chambers and dull corridors, on crooked staircases that made me pause, and even on the summit of an old machicolated square tower that made me dizzy, her morning music, her disposition to tell me so many more things than she asked, rang out and led me on. I have not seen Bly since the day I left it, and I dare say that to my older and more informed eyes it would now appear sufficiently contracted. But as my little conductress, with her hair of gold and her frock of blue, danced before me round corners and pattered down passages, I had the view of a castle of romance, inhabited by a rosy sprite, such a place as would somehow, for diversion of the young idea, take all colour out of storybooks and fairy tales. Wasn't it just a storybook over which I'd fallen a doze and a dream? No, it was a big, ugly, antique, but convenient house, embodying a few features of a building still older, half replaced and half utilized, in which I had the fancy of our being almost as lost as a handful of passengers in a great drifting ship. Well, I was, strangely, at the helm. This came home to me when 2 days later I drove over with Flora to meet, as Mrs. Gross said, the little gentleman, and all the more for an incident that, presenting itself the second evening, had deeply disconcerted me. The first day had been, on the whole, as I have expressed, reassuring, but I was to see it wind up in keen apprehension. The post-bag that evening, it came late, contained a letter for me, which, however, in the hand of my employer, I found to be composed but of a few words, enclosing another addressed to himself with a seal still unbroken. "This, I recognize, is from the headmaster, and the headmaster's an awful bore. Read him, please, deal with him, but mind you don't report. Not a word. I'm off." I broke the seal with a great effort, so great a one that I was a long time coming to it, took the unopened missive at last up to my room, and only attacked it just before going to bed. I had better have let it wait till morning, for it gave me a second sleepless night. With no counsel to take the next day, I was full of distress, and it finally got so the better of me that I determined to open myself at least to Mrs. Gross. What does it mean? The child's dismissed his school. She gave me a look that I remarked at the moment, then visibly, with a quick blankness, seemed to try to take it back. "But aren't they all sent home?" "Yes, but only for the holidays. Miles may never go back at all." Consciously, under my attention, she reddened. "They won't take him?" "They absolutely decline." At this she raised her eyes, which she had turned from me. I saw them fill with good tears. "What has he done?" I hesitated. Then I judged best simply to hand her my letter, which, however, had the effect of making her, without taking it, simply put her hands behind her. She shook her head sadly. "Such things are not for me, miss." My counsellor couldn't read. I winced at my mistake, which I attenuated as I could, and opened my letter again to repeat it to her. Then, faltering in the act, and folding it up once more, I put it back in my pocket. "Is he really bad?" The tears were still in her eyes. "Do the gentlemen say so?" "They go into no particulars. They simply express their regret that it should be impossible to keep him. That can have only one meaning." Mrs. Gross listened with dumb emotion. She forbore to ask me what this meaning might be, so that presently, to put the thing with some coherence, and with the mere aid of her presence to my own mind, I went on, "that he's an injury to the others." At this, with one of the quick turns of simple folk, she suddenly flamed up. "Master Miles! Him an injury!" There was such a flood of good faith in it, that though I had not yet seen the child, my very fears made me jump to the absurdity of the idea. I found myself, to meet my friend the better, offering it on the spot sarcastically to his poor little innocent mates. "It's too dreadful," cried Mrs. Grose, "to say such cruel things. Why, he's scarce 10 years old." Yes, it would be incredible. She was evidently grateful for such a profession. "See him, miss, first, then believe it." I felt forthwith a new impatience to see him. It was the beginning of a curiosity that for all the next hours was to deepen almost to pain. Mrs. Grose was aware I could judge of what she had produced in me, and she followed it up with assurance. "You might as well believe it of the little lady. Bless her," she added the next moment. "Look at her." I turned and saw that Flora, whom 10 minutes before I had established in the schoolroom with a sheet of white paper, a pencil, and a copy of nice round O's, now presented herself to view at the open door. She expressed, in her little way, an extraordinary detachment from disagreeable duties, looking at me, however, with a great childish light that seemed to offer it as a mere result of the affection she had conceived for my person, which had rendered necessary that she should follow me. I needed nothing more than this to feel the full force of Mrs. Grose's comparison, and catching my pupil in my arms, covered her with kisses, in which there was a sob of atonement. None the less, the rest of the day I watched for further occasion to approach my colleague, especially as, towards evening, I began to fancy she rather sought to avoid me. I overtook her, I remember, on the staircase. We went down together, and at the bottom I detained her, holding her there with a hand on her arm. "I take what you said to me at noon as a declaration that you've never known him to be bad." She threw back her head. She had clearly, by this time, and very honestly, adopted an attitude. "Oh, never known him, I don't pretend that." I was upset again. "Then you have known him?" "Yes, indeed, miss, thank God." On reflection, I accepted this. "You mean that a boy who never is no boy for me." I held her tighter. "You like them with the spirit to be naughty?" Then, keeping pace with her answer, "So do I eagerly brought out, "but not to the degree to contaminate." "To contaminate?" My big word left her at a loss. I explained it. "To corrupt." She stared, taking my meaning in, but it produced in her an odd laugh. "Are you afraid he'll corrupt you?" She put the question with such a fine, bold humour that with a laugh, a little silly, doubtless, to match her own, I gave way for the time to the apprehension of ridicule. But the next day, as the hour for my drive approached, I cropped up in another place. "What was the lady who was here before?" "The last governess. She was also young and pretty. Almost as young and almost as pretty, miss, even as you." "Ah, then, I hope her youth and her beauty helped her," I recollect throwing off. "He seems to like us young and pretty." "Oh, we did," Mrs. Grose assented. "It was the way he liked everyone." She had no sooner spoken, indeed, than she caught herself up. "I mean, that's his way, the master's." I was struck. "But of whom did you speak first?" She looked blank, but she coloured. "Why, of him." "Of the master?" "Of who else?" There was so obviously no one else that the next moment I had lost my impression of her having accidentally said more than she meant, and I merely asked what I wanted to know. "Did she see anything in the boy that wasn't right?" "She never told me." I had a scruple, but I overcame it. "Was she careful, particular?" Mrs. Grose appeared to try to be conscientious. "About some things, yes. But Not about all? Again she considered. Well, miss, she's gone. I won't tell tales. I quite understand your feeling, I hastened to reply, but I thought it, after an instant, not opposed to this concession, to pursue, Did she die here? No. She went off. I don't know what there was in this brevity of Mrs. Groce's that struck me as ambiguous. Went off to die? Mrs. Groce looked straight out of the window, but I felt that hypothetically I had a right to know what young persons engaged for Bly were expected to do. She was taken ill, you mean, and went home? She was not taken ill, so far as appeared, in this house. She left it at the end of the year to go home, as she said, for a short holiday, to which the time she'd put in had certainly given her a right. We had then a young woman, a nursemaid, who had stayed on, and who was a good girl and clever, and she took the children altogether for the interval. But our young lady never came back, and at the very moment I was expecting her, I heard from the master that she was dead. I turned this over. But of what? He never told me. But please, miss, said Mrs. Groce, I must get to my work. Her thus turning her back on me was fortunately not, for my just preoccupations, a snub that could check the growth of our mutual esteem. We met, after I had brought home little Miles, more intimately than ever, on the ground of my stupefaction, my general emotion. So monstrous was I then ready to pronounce it, that such a child as had now been revealed to me should be under an interdict. He was incredibly beautiful, and Mrs. Groce had put her finger on it. Everything but a sort of passion of tenderness for him was swept away by his presence. It would have been impossible to carry a bad name with a greater sweetness of innocence, and by the time I got back to Bly with him, I remained merely bewildered, so far, that is, as I was not outraged, by the sense of the horrible letter locked up in my room in a drawer. As soon as I could compass a private word with Mrs. Groce, I declared to her that it was grotesque. She promptly understood me. You mean the cruel charge? It doesn't live an instant. My dear woman, look at him. She smiled at my pretension to have discovered his charm. I assure you, miss, I do nothing else. What will you say, then? She immediately added. In answer to the letter? I had made up my mind. Nothing. And to his uncle? I was incisive. Nothing. And to the boy himself? I was wonderful. Nothing. She gave with her apron a great wipe to her mouth. Then I'll stand by you. We'll see it out. We'll see it out, I ardently echoed, giving her my hand to make it a vow. She held me there a moment, then whisked up her apron again with her detached hand. Would you mind, miss, if I used the freedom to kiss me? No. I took the good creature in my arms, and after we had embraced like sisters, felt still more fortified and indignant. I had undertaken with my companion to see it out, and I was under a charm, apparently, that could smooth away the extent and the far and difficult connections of such an effort. I was lifted aloft on a great wave of infatuation and pity. I found it simple in my ignorance, my confusion, and perhaps my conceit, to assume that I could deal with a boy whose education for the world was all on the point of beginning. Oh, it was a trap, not designed, but deep, to my imagination, to my delicacy, perhaps to my vanity, to whatever in me was most excitable. The best way to picture it all is to say that I was off my guard. They gave me so little trouble. They were of a gentleness so extraordinary. They had the bloom of health and happiness, and yet, as if I had been in charge of a pair of little grandees, of princes of the blood, for whom everything, to be right, would have to be enclosed and protected, the only form that in my fancy the after years could take for them was that of a romantic, a really royal extension of the garden and the park. It may be, of course, above all, that what suddenly broke into this gives the previous time a charm of stillness, that hush in which something gathers or crouches, The change was actually like the spring of a beast. In the first weeks, the days were long. They often, at their finest, gave me what I used to call my own hour, the hour when, for my pupils, tea-time and bedtime having come and gone, I had, before my final retirement, a small interval alone. Much as I liked my companions, this hour was the thing in the day I liked most, and I liked it best of all when, as the light faded, or rather, I should say, the day lingered, and the last calls of the last birds sounded in a flushed sky from the old trees, I could take a turn into the grounds and enjoy, almost with a sense of property that amused and flattered me, the beauty and dignity of the place. One of the thoughts that, as I don't in the least shrink now from noting, used to be with me in these wanderings was that it would be as charming as a charming story suddenly to meet someone. Someone would appear there at the turn of a path and would stand before me and smile and approve. I didn't ask more than that. I only asked that he should know. And the only way to be sure he knew would be to see it, and the kind light of it in his handsome face. That was exactly present to me, by which I mean the face was, when at the end of a long June day I stopped short on emerging from one of the plantations and coming into view of the house. What arrested me on the spot, and with a shock much greater than any vision had allowed for, was the sense that my imagination had in a flash turned real. He did stand there, but high up, beyond the lawn, and at the very top of the tower to which on that first morning little Flora had conducted me. It produced in me, this figure in the clear twilight, I remember, two distinct gasps of emotion, which were sharply the shock of my first and that of my second surprise. My second was a violent perception of the mistake of my first. The man who met my eyes was not the person I had precipitately supposed. An unknown man in a lonely place is a permitted object of fear to a young woman privately bred, and the figure that faced me was, a few more seconds assured me, as little anyone else I knew as it was the image that had been in my mind. I had not seen it in Harley Street. I had not seen it anywhere. It was as if, while I took in what I did take in, all the rest of the scene had been stricken with death. I can hear again, as I write, the intense hush in which the sounds of evening dropped. The rooks stopped cawing in the golden sky, and the friendly hour lost for the minute all its voice. We were too far apart to call to each other, but there was a moment at which, at shorter range, some challenge between us, breaking the hush, would have been the right result of our straight mutual stare. He was in one of the angles, the one away from the house, very erect as it struck me, and with both hands on the ledge. So I saw him as I see the letters I form on this page. Then, exactly after a minute, as if to add to the spectacle, he slowly changed his place, passed, looking at me hard all the while, to the opposite corner of the platform. Yes, I had the sharpest sense that during this transit he never took his eyes from me, and I can see at this moment the way his hand, as he went, passed from one of the crenellations to the next. He stopped at the other corner, but less long, and even as he turned away, still markedly fixed me. He turned away. That was all I knew. It was a queer affair enough. There were hours during the following days, or at least there were moments snatched even from clear duties, when I had to shut myself up to think. The shock I had suffered must have sharpened all my senses. I felt sure at the end of 3 days, and as a result of mere closer attention, that I had not been practiced upon by the servants, nor made the object of any game. Of whatever it was that I knew nothing was known around me. There was but one sane inference. Someone had taken a liberty, rather gross. That was what, repeatedly, I dipped into my room and locked the door to say to myself. We had been, collectively, subject to an intrusion. Some unscrupulous traveller, curious in old houses, had made his way in unobserved, enjoyed the prospect from the best point of view, and then stolen out as he came. If he had given me such a bold, hard stare, that was but a part of his indiscretion. The good thing, after all, was that we should surely see no more of him. There was a Sunday, to get on, when it rained with such force and for so many hours that there could be no procession to church, in consequence of which, as the day declined, I had arranged with Mrs. Grose that should the evening show improvement, we would attend together the late service. The rain happily stopped, and I prepared for our walk, which through the park and by the good road to the village would be a matter of 20 minutes. Coming downstairs to meet my colleague in the hall, I remembered a pair of gloves that had required 3 stitches, and that had received them, with a publicity perhaps not edifying, while I sat with the children at their tea, served on Sundays, by exception, in the cold, clean temple of mahogany and brass, the grown-up dining-room. The gloves had been dropped there, and I turned in to recover them. The day was grey enough, but the afternoon light still lingered, and it enabled me, on crossing the threshold, not only to recognize on a chair near the wide window, then closed, the articles I wanted, but to become aware of a person on the other side of the window, and looking straight in. One step into the room had sufficed. My vision was instantaneous. It was all there. The person looking straight in was the person who had already appeared to me. He appeared thus again with, I won't say greater distinctness, for that was impossible, but with a nearness that represented a forward stride in our intercourse, and made me, as I met him, catch my breath and turn cold. He was the same. He was the same, and seen this time as he had been seen before, from the waist up, the window, though the dining-room was on the ground floor, not going down to the terrace on which he stood. His face was close to the glass, yet the effect of this better view was strangely only to show me how intense the former had been. He remained but a few seconds, long enough to convince me he also saw and recognized, but it was as if I had been looking at him for years, and had known him always. Something, however, happened this time that had not happened before. His stare into my face, through the glass and across the room, was as deep and hard as then, but it quitted me for a moment, during which I could still watch it, see it fix successively several other things. On the spot there came to me the added shock of a certitude that it was not for me he had come there. He had come for somebody else. The flash of this knowledge, for it was knowledge in the midst of dread, produced in me the most extraordinary effect. Started, as I stood there, a sudden vibration of duty and courage. I say courage because I was beyond all doubt already far gone. I bounded straight out of the door again, reached that of the house, got in an instant upon the drive, and passing along the terrace as fast as I could rush, turned a corner and came full in sight. The terrace and the whole place, the lawn and the garden beyond it, all I could see of the park, were empty, with a great emptiness. There were shrubberies and big trees, but I remember the clear assurance I felt that none of them concealed him. He was there, or was not there. Not there if I didn't see him. I got hold of this. Then, instinctively, instead of returning as I had come, went to the window. It was confusedly present to me that I ought to place myself where he stood. I did so. I applied my face to the pane, and looked as he had looked into the room. As if, at this moment, to show me exactly what his range had been, Mrs. Gross, as I had done for himself just before, came in from the hall. With this I had the full image of a repetition of what had already occurred. She saw me, as I had seen my own visitant. She pulled up short, as I had done. I gave her something of the shock that I had received. She turned white, and this made me ask myself if I had blanched as much. She stared, in short, and retreated on just my lines, and I knew she had then passed out and come round to me, and that I should presently meet her. I remained where I was, and while I waited I thought of more things than one, but there's only one I take space to mention. I wondered why she should be scared. Oh, she let me know as soon as round the corner of the house she loomed again into view. "What in the name of goodness is the matter?" She was now flushed and out of breath. I said nothing till she came quite near. "With me?" I must have made a wonderful face. "Do I show it?" "You're as white as a sheet. You look awful. What was it?" "An extraordinary man, looking in." "What extraordinary man?" I hadn't the least idea. Mrs. Gross gazed round us in vain.
"Then where has he gone?"
I know still less.
"Have you seen him before?"
"Yes, once, on the old tower."
"What was he doing on the tower?"
"Only standing there and looking down at me." She thought a minute, after which she added,
"What is he like?"
"He's like nobody."
"Nobody?"
she echoed. "He has no hat." Then, seeing in her face that she already, in this, with a deeper dismay, found a touch of picture, I quickly added, stroke to stroke, "He has red hair, very red, close curling, and a pale face, long in shape, with straight, good features, and little, rather queer whiskers that are as red as his hair. His eyebrows are somehow darker. They look particularly arched, as if they might move a good deal. His eyes are sharp, strange, awfully. But I only know clearly that they're rather small and very fixed. His mouth's wide and his lips are thin, and except for his little whiskers, he's quite clean-shaven. He gives me a sort of sense of looking like an actor."
"An actor?"
It was impossible to resemble one less, at least, than Mrs. Gross at that moment. "I've never seen one, but so I suppose them. He's tall, active, erect," I continued, "but never, no, never a gentleman." My companion's face had blanched as I went on. Her round eyes started, and her mild mouth gaped. "A gentleman?" she gasped, confounded, stupefied. "A gentleman? He—" "You know him, then?" She visibly tried to hold herself.
"But he is handsome."
I saw the way to help her. "Remarkably."
"And dressed?"
"In somebody's clothes. They're smart, but they're not his own." She broke into a breathless, affirmative groan.
"Oh, they're the master's."
I caught it up. "You do know him?" She faltered but a second.
"Quint!" she cried.
"Quint?"
"Peter Quint. His own man, his valet, when he was here."
"When the master was?" Gaping still, but meeting me, she pieced it all together.
"He never wore his hat, but he did wear... Well, there were waistcoats missed. They were both here last year. Then the master went, and Quint was alone."
I followed, but halting a little. "Alone?"
"Alone with us."
Then, as from a deeper depth,
"In charge," she added.
"And what became of him?" She hung fire so long that I was still more mystified.
"He went too," she brought out at last.
"Went where?" Her expression at this became extraordinary.
"God knows where. He died." "Died!"
I almost shrieked.
She seemed fairly to square herself, plant herself more firmly, to utter the wonder of it. Yes, Mr. Quint is dead. It took, of course, more than that particular passage to place us together in presence of what we had now to live with as we could. My dreadful liability to impressions of the order so vividly exemplified, and my companion's knowledge, henceforth, a knowledge half consternation and half compassion of that liability. We had gone over and over every feature of what I had seen. He was looking for someone else, you say, someone who was not you. He was looking for little Miles. A portentous clearness now possessed me. That's whom he was looking for. But how do you know? I know! My exultation grew. And you know, my dear. She didn't deny this, but I required, I felt, not even so much telling as that. She resumed in a moment, at any rate. What if he should see him? Little Miles? Ha! That's what he wants. She looked immensely scared again. The child! Heaven forbid! The man! He wants to appear to them. That he might was an awful conception, and yet somehow I could keep at bay, which, moreover, as we lingered there, was what I succeeded in practically proving. I had an absolute certainty that I should see again what I had already seen, but something within me said that by offering myself bravely as the sole subject of such experience, by accepting, by inviting, by surmounting it all, I should serve as an expiatory victim and guard the tranquillity of my companions. The children in especial I should thus fence about and absolutely save. I recall one of the last things I said that night to Mrs. Gross. It does strike me that my pupils have never mentioned— She looked at me hard as I musingly pulled up— his having been here, and the time they were with him. The time they were with him, and his name, his presence, his history, in any way. Oh, the little lady doesn't remember. She never heard or knew. The circumstances of his death? I thought with some intensity. Perhaps not. But Miles would remember. Miles would know. Ah, don't try him, broke from Mrs. Gross. I returned her the look she had given me. Don't be afraid. I continued to think. It is rather odd that he has never spoken of him. Never by the least allusion. And you tell me they were great friends? Oh, it wasn't him, Mrs. Gross with emphasis declared. It was Quint's own fancy. To play with him. I mean, to spoil him. She paused a moment. Then she added, Quint was much too free. This gave me, straight from my vision of his face, such a face, a sudden sickness of disgust. Too free with my boy? Too free with everyone. I have it from you, then, for it's of great importance that he was definitely and admittedly bad? Oh, not admittedly. I knew it, but the master didn't. And you never told him? Well, he didn't like tale-bearing. He hated complaints. He was terribly short with anything of that kind, and if people were all right to him, he wouldn't be bothered with more. This squared well enough with my impression of him. He was not a trouble-loving gentleman, nor so very particular, perhaps, about some of the company he kept. All the same, I pressed my interlocutress. I promise you, I would have told. She felt my discrimination. I dare say I was wrong. But really I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of things that man could do. Quint was so clever, was so deep. I took this in still more than probably I showed. You weren't afraid of anything else? Not of his effect? His effect? She repeated with a face of anguish, and waiting while I faltered. On innocent little precious lives. They were in your charge. No, they were not in mine, she roundly and distressfully returned. The master believed in him, and placed him here because he was supposed not to be well, and the country air so good for him. So he had everything to say. Yes, she let me have it, even about them. Them? That creature! I had to smother a kind of howl. you could bear it. No, I couldn't. And I can't now.
And the poor woman burst into tears. A rigid control from the next day was, as I have said, to follow them. Much as we had discussed it that Sunday night, I was, in the immediate later hours in especial, for it may be imagined whether I slept, still haunted with the shadow of something she had not told me. I myself had kept back nothing, but there was a word Mrs. Grose had kept back. I was sure, moreover, by morning, that this was not from a failure of frankness, but because on every side there were fears. It seems to me, indeed, in retrospect, that by the time the morrow's sun was high, I had restlessly read into the facts before us almost all the meaning they were to receive from subsequent and more cruel occurrences. What they gave me above all was just the sinister figure of the living man, the dead one would keep a while, and of the months he had continuously passed at Bly, which added up made a formidable stretch. The limit of this evil time had arrived only when, on the dawn of a winter's morning, Peter Quint was found by a labourer going to early work, stone dead on the road from the village. A catastrophe explained, superficially at least, by a visible wound to his head, such a wound as might have been produced, and as, on the final evidence, had been, by a fatal slip in the dark, and after leaving the public house on the steepish, icy slope, a wrong path altogether, at the bottom of which he lay. The icy slope, the term mistaken at night and in liquor, accounted for much, practically in the end, and after the inquest and boundless chatter, for everything. But there had been matters in his life, strange passages and perils, secret disorders, vices more than suspected, that would have accounted for a good deal more. I scarce know how to put my story into words that shall be a credible picture of my state of mind. But I was, in these days, literally able to find a joy in the extraordinary flight of heroism the occasion demanded of me. I now saw that I had been asked for a service admirable and difficult, and there would be a greatness in letting it be seen, oh, in the right quarter, that I could succeed where many another girl might have failed. It was an immense help to me, I confess I rather applaud myself as I look back, that I saw my service so strongly and so simply. I was there to protect and defend the little creatures, in the world the most bereaved and the most lovable, the appeal of whose helplessness had suddenly become only too explicit, a deep, constant ache of one's own committed heart. We were cut off, really together. We were united in our danger. They had nothing but me, and I had them. I began to watch them in stifled suspense, a disguised excitement that might well, had it continued too long, have turned to something like madness. What saved me, as I now see, was that it turned to something else altogether. It didn't last as suspense. It was superseded by horrible proofs. Proofs, I say, yes, from the moment I really took hold. This moment dated from the afternoon hour that I happened to spend in the grounds with the younger of my pupils, alone. We were on the edge of the lake, and as we had lately begun geography, the lake was the Sea of Azov. Suddenly, in these circumstances, I became aware that on the other side of the Sea of Azov we had an interested spectator. I had sat down with a piece of work on the old stone bench which overlooked the pond, and in this position I began to take in, with certitude, and yet without direct vision, the presence, at a distance, of a third person. Of the positive identity of the apparition I would assure myself as soon as the small clock of my courage should have ticked out the right second. Meanwhile, with an effort that was already sharp enough, I transferred my eyes straight to little Flora, who at the moment was about 10 yards away. My heart had stood still for an instant with the wonder and terror of the question whether she too would see, and I held my breath while I waited for what a cry from her, what some sudden innocent sign, either of interest or of alarm, would tell me. I waited, but nothing came. Then, in the first place, and there is something more dire in this, I feel, than in anything I have to relate, I was determined by a sense that, within a minute, all sounds from her had previously dropped, and in the second, by the circumstance that also within the minute she had in her play turned her back to the water. This was her attitude when I at last looked at her, looked with the confirmed conviction that we were still, together, under direct personal notice. She had picked up a small flat piece of wood, which happened to have in it a little hole that had evidently suggested to her the idea of sticking in another fragment that might figure as a mast and make the thing a boat. This second morsel, as I watched her, she was very markedly and intently attempting to tighten in its place. My apprehension of what she was doing sustained me, so that after some seconds I felt I was ready for more. Then I again shifted my eyes. I faced what I had to face. I got hold of Mrs. Gross as soon after this as I could, and I can give no intelligible account of how I fought out the interval. Yet I still hear myself cry as I fairly threw myself into her arms. "They know! It's too monstrous! They know! They know!" "And what on earth?" I felt her incredulity as she held me. "Why, all that we know, and heaven knows what else besides." Then as she released me, I made it out to her, made it out perhaps only now with full coherency, even to myself. 2 hours ago, in the garden, I could scarce articulate, Flora saw. Mrs. Gross took it as she might have taken a blow in the stomach. "She has told you?" she panted. "Not a word. That's the horror. She kept it to herself. The child of 8. That child." Unutterable still for me was the stupefaction of it. Mrs. Gross, of course, could only gape the wider. "Then how do you know?" "I was there. I saw with my eyes, saw that she was perfectly aware." "Do you mean aware of him?" "No, of her." I was conscious as I spoke that I looked prodigious things, for I got the slow reflection of them in my companion's face. Another person, this time, but a figure of quite as unmistakable horror and evil. A woman in black, pale and dreadful, with such an air also, and such a face, on the other side of the lake. I was there with the child, quiet for the hour, and in the midst of it, she came. How? From where? From where they come from. She just appeared and stood there, but not so near, and without coming nearer. Oh, for the effect and the feeling, she might have been as close as you. My friend, with an odd impulse, fell back a step. Was she someone you've never seen? Yes, but someone the child has, someone you have. Then, to show how I had thought it all out, my predecessor, the one who died. Miss Jessel? Miss Jessel. You don't believe me? I pressed. She turned right and left in her distress. How can you be sure? This drew from me, in the state of my nerves, a flash of impatience. Then ask Flora. She's sure. But I had no sooner spoken than I caught myself up. No, for God's sake, don't. She'll say she isn't. She'll lie. Mrs. Gross was not too bewildered instinctively to protest. Oh, how can you? Because I'm clear. Flora doesn't want me to know. It's only then to spare you. No, there are depths.
The more I go over it, the more I see in it, and the more I see in it, the more I fear. I don't know what I don't see, what I don't fear. Mrs. Gross tried to keep up with me. You mean you're afraid of seeing her again? Oh, no, that's nothing now. Then I explained. It's of not seeing her. But my companion only looked wan. I don't understand you. Why, it's that the child may keep it up, and that the child assuredly will, without my knowing it. At the image of this possibility, Mrs. Gross for a moment collapsed, yet presently to pull herself together again, as if from the positive force of the sense of what, should we yield an inch, there would really be to give way to. Oh, dear, dear, we must keep our heads. And after all, if she doesn't mind it, she even tried a grim joke. Perhaps she likes it. Likes such things, a scrap of an infant? Oh, isn't it just a proof of her blessed innocence? My friend bravely inquired. She brought me for the instant almost round. Oh, we must clutch at that, we must cling to it. If it isn't a proof of what you say, it's a proof of God knows what. For the woman's a horror of horrors. Mrs. Gross, at this, fixed her eyes a minute on the ground, then at last raising them, "Tell me how you know," she said. "Then you admit it's what she was?" I cried. "Tell me how you know," my friend simply repeated. "No. By seeing her, by the way she looked." "At you? Do you mean so wickedly?" Dear me, no, I could have borne that. She gave me never a glance. She only fixed the child. Mrs. Gross tried to see it. Fixed her? Ah, with such awful eyes. She stared at mine as if they might really have resembled them. "Do you mean of dislike?" "God help us, no. Of something much worse." "Worse than dislike?" This left her indeed at a loss. "With a determination indescribable, with a kind of fury of intention." I made her turn pale. Intention? To get hold of her. Mrs. Gross, her eyes just lingering on mine, gave a shudder and walked to the window, and while she stood there looking out, I completed my statement. "That's what Flora knows." After a while she turned round. "The person was in black, you say?" "In mourning, rather poor, almost shabby, but yes, with extraordinary beauty." I now recognized to what I had at last, stroke by stroke, brought the victim of my confidence, for she quite visibly weighed this. "Oh, handsome, very, very," I insisted. "Wonderfully handsome, but infamous." She slowly came back to me. "Miss Jessel was infamous." She once more took my hand in both her own, holding it as tight as if to fortify me against the increase of alarm I might draw from this disclosure. "They were both infamous," she finally said. So for a little we faced it once more together, and I found absolutely a degree of help in seeing it now so straight. "I appreciate," I said, "the decency of your not having hitherto spoken, but the time has certainly come to give me the whole thing." She appeared to assent to this, but still only in silence, seeing which I went on, "I must have it now. Of what did she die? Come, there was something between them. There was everything." "In spite of the difference?" "Oh, of their rank, their condition." She brought it woefully out. "She was a lady." I turned it over. I again saw. Yes, she was a lady. "And he so dreadfully below," said Mrs. Gross. I felt that I doubtless needn't press too hard in such company on the place of a servant in the scale, but there was nothing to prevent an acceptance of my companion's own measure of my predecessor's abasement. There was a way to deal with that, and I dealt. The more readily for my full vision on the evidence of our employer's late, clever, good-looking own man,
impudent, assured, spoiled, depraved. The fellow was a hound. Mrs. Grose considered, as if it were perhaps a little a case for a sense of shades. I've never seen one like him. He did what he wished. With her? With them all. It was as if now, in my friend's own eyes, Miss Jessel had again appeared. I seemed at any rate for an instant to see their evocation of her as distinctly as I had seen her by the pond, and I brought out with decision, it must have been also what she wished. Mrs. Grose's face signified that it had been indeed, but she said at the same time, poor woman, she paid for it. Then you do know what she died of? I asked. No, I know nothing. I wanted not to know. I was glad enough I didn't, and I thanked heaven she was well out of this. Yet you had then your idea of her real reason for leaving? Oh, yes, as to that. She couldn't have stayed. Fancy it here, for a governess. And afterwards, I imagined, and I still imagine, and what I imagine is dreadful. Not so dreadful as what I do, I replied, on which I must have shown her, as I was indeed but too conscious, a front of miserable defeat. It brought out again all her compassion for me, and at the renewed touch of her kindness, my power to resist broke down. I burst, as I had the other time made her burst, into tears. She took me to her motherly breast, and my lamentation overflowed. I don't do it, I sobbed in despair. I don't save or shield them. It's far worse than I dreamed. They're lost. There came suddenly an hour after which, as I look back, the affair seems to me to have been all pure suffering. But I have at least reached the heart of it, and the straightest road out is doubtless to advance. One evening I sat reading by a couple of candles. I remember that the book I had in my hand was Fielding's Amelia, also that I was wholly awake. I recall further both a general conviction that it was horribly late and a particular objection to looking at my watch. I figure finally that the white curtain draping in the fashion of those days the head of Flora's little bed shrouded, as I had assured myself long before, the perfection of childish rest. I recollect, in short, that though I was deeply interested in my author, I found myself at the turn of a page, and with his spell all scattered, looking straight up from him and hard at the door of my room. There was a moment during which I listened, couched by a faint sense of there being something undefinably astir in the house, and noted the soft breath of the open casement just move the half-drawn blind. Then, with all the marks of a deliberation that must have seemed magnificent, had there been anyone to admire it, I laid down my book, rose to my feet, and taking a candle went straight out of the room, and from the passage on which my light made little impression, noiselessly closed and locked the door. I can say now neither what determined nor what guided me, but I went straight along the lobby, holding my candle high, till I came within sight of the tall window that presided over the great turn of the staircase. My candle, under a bold flourish, went out, and I perceived by the uncovered window that the yielding dusk of earliest morning rendered it unnecessary. Without it, the next instant, I saw that there was someone on the stair. I speak of sequences, but I required no lapse of seconds to stiffen myself for a third encounter with Quint. The apparition had reached the landing halfway up, and was therefore on the spot nearest the window, where at sight of me it stopped short, and fixed me exactly as it had fixed me from the tower and from the garden. He knew me as well as I knew him, and so, in the cold, faint twilight, with a glimmer in the high glass and another on the polish of the oak stair below, we faced each other in our common intensity. He was, absolutely on this occasion,
a living, detestable, dangerous presence.
But that was not the wonder of wonders. I reserve this distinction for quite another circumstance, the circumstance that dread had unmistakably quitted me, and that there was nothing in me there that didn't meet and measure him. I had plenty of anguish after that extraordinary moment, but I had, thank God, no terror, and he knew I had not. I found myself at the end of an instant magnificently aware of this. I felt, in a fierce rigour of confidence, that if I stood my ground a minute I should cease, for the time at least, to have him to reckon with, and during the minute, accordingly, the thing was as human and hideous as a real interview. Hideous, just because it was human, as to have met alone in the small hours in a sleeping house some enemy, some adventurer, some criminal. It was the dead silence of our long gaze at such close quarters that gave the whole horror, huge as it was, its only note of the unnatural. If I had met a murderer in such a place, and at such an hour, we still at least would have spoken. Something would have passed in life between us. If nothing had passed, one of us would have moved. The moment was so prolonged that it would have taken but little more to make me doubt if even I were in life. I can't express what followed it, save by saying that the silence itself, which was indeed in a manner an attestation of my strength, became the element into which I saw the figure disappear, in which I definitely saw it turn, as I might have seen the low wretch to which it had once belonged turn on receipt of an order, and pass, with my eyes on the villainous back that no hunch could have more disfigured, straight down the staircase and into the darkness in which the next bend was lost.